office? Is it fine?
A little bit in the corner, but it's fine.
It's fine. Okay.
Bill, do you have that? Oh, here it says it's setting up.
I'm on YouTube now.
Okay.
I see it.
Okay, great.
Now I'm going to mute YouTube this time.
Is it fine?
There you go.
And so this goes on our Facebook page, and I'm going to tweet it out as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to send a message to everyone in the waiting room.
Nice. All right. That's up. It's up on Twitter. I just posted Blazakis as well today, so hopefully that'll be good.
Great, thank you.
I've gone through 19 rounds of things with Edie, but I got a receipt today for $75. So maybe it's just on a delay. I don't know.
Okay, great.
But I'm taking Edie and I are taking care of that.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it.
This means I have a minute to use the bathroom too, so I will be right back.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
All
So we're
right.
just waiting for Kyron.
Okay.
Would you want me to let everyone in from the waiting room? Or, I mean, I know Kyron was going to introduce you, so.
Whatever works.
Okay.
I'm on another planet. Everything's just flowing together. I don't care. It's all the same to me.
Strange time.
Close that window.
Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and let people in. And we may need to get started without Kyron, just in the interest of time. She may have gotten stuck in a meeting or something. So I will go ahead and let everyone in. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Dr. Skinner, you're incognito on Edie's Zoom today.
Oh, I don't know how that happened, but here I am.
Okay.
Maybe we can try to fix that, but let's do that later. Let me jump right in and introduce our speaker. I'm so excited about this initiative, and I know we're all scattered about in different places, but this is really important that we begin to hear from CMU faculty and faculty of color in particular. And so I'm here to introduce our speaker, Professor Jason England. And Jason, thank you for agreeing. Before I introduce Jason any further, though, I should mention that this whole idea of hearing from faculty of color really emerged in conversations the new Student Advisory Committee within the Institute of Politics and Strategy, a group of undergraduates who've taken it upon themselves to seriously think about ways that we can bring diversity, not just into IPS, but into the university more broadly. They're spending too much of their time, I think, on the charge that we've got to be, we have to live what we want to be. And I think they are doing work that I had no idea they would actually do. And along the way, they said we really need to hear from people, their professional and personal journey. We have some who are national and international figures who aren't at CMU, who you will hear from. But we also talked about hearing from a number of people of color on campus who are distinguished in their own right, but we don't actually spend much time talking with them. So Jason came up, Professor England, as right away because I met him on Zoom, and the students, some of them already know him in the English department. And so he will be our first speaker. So this is our first test at having this kind of conversation. The goal of the conversation, I think, is for us to get a better sense in the CU community of who's actually part of our community, and to realize that we have a much richer, diverse community than we have thought, given the fact that our leadership at CMU doesn't look like America, doesn't look much different than the group that walked with Donald Trump and stood in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. But despite what it may look like, the reality is that we are a lot more diverse in our thoughts, ideas, and in our people. So let me turn first to say a little bit about Professor England. I don't want to take too much time on that point. I'll turn it back over to Allie for instructions, and then Professor England will begin his discussion, and I'll ask a question or two. I have one planted because there is a presidential debate tonight. And I hope you all are going to watch. I insist that you do. And so I want to get his thoughts on a couple of things that are going on around race and culture in the context of this debate. Professor England was born, of all places, in New York City, and spent a lot of his younger years in homeless environments and in housing projects. He's had this amazing professional journey from basically being homeless to having been dean of admissions at Wesleyan University, to getting a MFA at the quite iconic and revered Iowa Writers Workshop, winning prizes for his fiction writing, and finding a really scholarly space in as a public intellectual, writing for the Chronicle of Higher Education and Sports Illustrated, among others. So he is, to me, the quintessential CMU person in that he's interdisciplinary. He brings a kind of a different perspective to problems of race, politics, and culture, using lots of ideas and technologies and pulling from his own background. And that's just what CMU, I think, especially in Dietrich College, should be doing more of, and he's doing it full time. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Allie Moyer, who I must thank for organizing this event as a staff member in IPS, and then let's get going.
Thanks, Dr. Skinner. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a couple of house rules before we get started. If you are comfortable turning on your video, that's totally fine. Please do keep your microphones muted during the talk though. Background noise tends to interfere. And then we'll open it up to Q&A after Professor England gives his remarks. And in order to participate in the Q&A, please either use the raise hand function or type them in the chat to me and I will get those relayed. So without further ado, Professor England, thank you.
Hey, how are you? I'm honored to be here. You know, I thank you for having me I had an experience when I was in graduate school, when I was doing my MFA. It was my birthday, quite truly. And I was in a workshop with Marilyn Robinson, who I think arguably is the greatest American living fiction writer, certainly in the conversation. And Marilyn Robinson liked a short story I wrote, and it was a very brief short story. And she read it out loud to the class. Certainly drawing the ire of many of my classmates, you know, whether outwardly or not, for a long time for me. But my fiction never sounded better, and it never will. You know, her reading it made it better. It elevated my own work. And in fact, it was probably quite an ordinary story, and it suddenly sounded extraordinary. And I would say that Dr. Skinner's intro probably just did the same to my fledgling career in academia. So I thank you very much for that kind introduction. I have written some pieces that have been very popular for the Chronicle of Higher Education on equity in admissions, on Carnegie Mellon and other universities in America, and their sort of bland statements in the wake of civic unrest and police murdering and the tendency of universities to manage themselves the way you would expect Coca-Cola or any other major brand to do so. Recently wrote about Jessica Krug and the grift of Black grievance as well. And I'm not sure I'm going to talk about any of that. What I do appreciate is that there's been no precedent, that I'm the first talk in the test run. That means you won't know how bad this is if it is bad. So I also want to acknowledge that I saw one student from one of my classes here. Only one. And CJ, you were guaranteed an A just for showing up and supporting me. I've seen a couple of my colleagues. I'm suspicious of why you're here, and I hope you don't heckle me. So I don't know how to talk about my professional journey because it has not been traditional. It has not been particularly coherent. It doesn't fit well into, I think, the expected narrative of an academic. I'll draw a little bit from a piece I wrote about college admissions here as I start. I wrote, my mother is hyper intelligent and insightful. Throughout my childhood, she was also depressed and we were impoverished. During the 80s, we lived in some of New York's worst neighborhoods, including a several-year stint in a notorious Times Square drug den, a welfare hotel called the Holland. Still, she provided me with an ethical foundation and exposed me to as many books and as much culture as she could. I remember an art book she brought home once, which had a discussion of Monet's paintings of the ruined cathedral. I couldn't understand why someone would want to repaint the same thing over and over again. To bring it back, my mother said, to think of it in a new way. Her care, intelligence, and determination helped me chart a course that reads like American Dream propaganda, from homeless in the 80s to a graduate of a prep school, recipient of a degree from an elite university, holder of an MFA from the Ira Writers Workshop. But exactly who that narrative belongs to and what it means didn't become clear to me until I became an assistant dean of admissions in 2003. So I think about that a lot, this idea of bringing it back and thinking of it in a new way. You know, this is part and parcel of what the best intellectuals and writers do. And I'm deeply invested in this sort of thing. I'm also deeply invested in issues of equity and justice, the power of narrative, the tenuous line between narrative and mythology and who narrative belongs to, the difference between nostalgia and history and the importance of reckoning morally with history so that we avoid nostalgia. And as Dr. Skinner pointed out, you know, I overcame homelessness and housing projects. I graduated from a private high school, cum laude, with distinctions in science and English and history, math and theology. I graduated from Wesleyan University with high honors, award for best thesis in my department, among other prizes I gathered on the way out the door. I got a fellowship to attend the best writing program in the nation and 2 prestigious fellowships shortly after graduating. And I'm reciting those not narcissistically, but to make the point that that's really my mythology. You know, those are my credentials. And those can get me into certain rooms, I suppose, but it tells you very little about who I am. The point is that my story reads as if it's remarkable, but I can assess myself as pretty damn regular. I had a lot of trouble grabbing a glass of water just now even to show up for this talk. I know that in many ways I'm mediocre. And I think something that I find fascinating about academia is how many people have bought into their own mythology and how much that hurts the way we view the world. A writer, no matter what the context, is made an outsider by the demands of his vocation. That was something that James Allen McPherson said in his foreword to the stories of Brees Pancake. Brees passed early, possibly of shooting himself with a shotgun, although some people insist that he was murdered. James Allen McPherson, who was the first Black man to win a Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, passed maybe about 7 years ago, 5 to 7 years ago, forgotten by many. But he's right, you know, by demands of your vocation, I think a good writer is made an outsider. And that's kind of who I am. I'm someone who ends up places and observes. I wish that there was more magic to it than that. But my gift is that I kind of let life carry me around, drop me down someplace. I listen, I see with the clarity of a man forever at the margins, and I report. You know, I celebrate the human. I respect life as a perpetual ambush and perpetual coping and occasional communion with kindred spirits. And I understand that the journey is really to somewhere, but it's often internal. Right. In one of my classes, and CJ is in that class, we've been reading Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, which is a profoundly quiet meditation on individual and communal identity. And it's about people who have not managed to connect with a place or a purpose, a routine, or in some cases, even another person. And it's about the immensely resourceful sadness of a certain kind of American, someone who's fallen out of history and is trying to invent a life without assistance of any kind, without even recognizing that there are precedents. And it's about a woman who is so far from everyone else that it would be presumptuous to put a name to her frame of mind. And I relate deeply to Marilyn's characters. I feel like a person who is American in the sense that I don't have a real home. Beyond being homeless, I've been all over this country, and I don't feel that I really particularly belong to a specific group. And I think that's a strength of this country in its ideal form. I think you have to see the face of death in order to start writing seriously, Carlos Fuentes said in 1981 in a Paris Review interview. When you start seeing the face of death, you feel you have to rescue these things. I think writers are prone to this sort of extreme and dramatic expression, and it's a bit extreme if you look at any MFA program with a bestsellers list or any given day of the litany of self-promoting grifters on social media. You know, you can assess that the bulk of them haven't seen the face of death or anywhere too far beyond their navels. But I do understand and feel a sort of kinship with Fuentes here. You know, his sentiments also call to mind something Marilyn Robinson said that stayed with me, which is memory is the sense of loss, and the loss pulls us after it. So I write, I teach, and I suppose I'm here today because I've seen the face of death and because memory is a sense of loss and loss has pulled me after it. I've gone to some improbable corners to figuratively rescue that loss and to find some redemption for inequity and suffering and wasted potential, and even the self-immolation of bright lights I've known who turned their fire inward when society left them no maneuvering room to use it constructively. My own story is that I was in a welfare hotel in the 1980s in Times Square. It was essentially a crack house. I mean, we ended up there because of unfortunate circumstances. My mother was extremely intelligent, but mentally unwell at the time. Gunshots in the hallway were normal. Drug dealing and drug use in the stairwells were daily rituals. I recalled a couple who plunged their deaths down the freight elevator shaft right next to the hotel room we occupied. We heard them as they fell down. As a child, I still hear their screams echoing in my head some nights. The man who was stabbed in the chest by his wife right across the hall from us. My mother, once the knife was pulled from his chest, he pulled it out himself. He didn't want his wife to go to jail. My mother took it, hid it. I washed it. I carried it with me for about 30 years as this weird sort of keepsake to that time in my life. And then one day I just let it go. I watched Santa Claus run for his life. This is a memory that stays with me. I would say almost daily I think about this. I was 7 years old, and the people who lived in this dystopian hotel, which was really a shelter for the wayward and the homeless, we were invited to the Javits Center one year. School bus showed up, picked up all the mothers and their children and the hangers-on, and it took us to a big banquet hall, nice silverware, you know, china, great glasses, and we all sat down as if we were civilized and as if we had a life. And there was a Santa, and this Santa was clearly, now looking back, having had experience in life, I can see this now at 7, I didn't know it. This was probably some liberal arts kid. It's like some kid who dressed up as Santa to do a good deed. And at 7 even, I was riveted because I noticed that the line was not going down, but Santa's sack was being depleted, So people just kept getting back in line. They were grabbing as many toys as possible. They were cutting the line. Some people had 8 toys, other people had none. There was unrest. And you could hear the din of conversation turn into sort of roar of protest. And my mother looked at me. She was sitting at a table. We were alone at that point, and she said, "You sit there." And we watched as Santa slowly realized this and coped with the horrific reality that the sack was going to be empty and he was in trouble. And suddenly Santa got up and he bolted for the door. And there was a line of people chasing Santa down. I can laugh at this now. At 7, it wasn't necessarily funny. It was a living nightmare. But they were trying to beat Santa's ass. And my mother told me to remain calm and remain still. Now, in the midst of this, a woman had grabbed a garbage bag and was clearing tables off. She was stealing forks, plates, glasses, anything not nailed down. And I watched my mother calmly, observing her, and the woman finally got to our table. And the woman, as my mother just sort of coolly stared at her, says, "What the fuck are you looking at?" And I will never forget this till the day I die. My mother said very calmly and elegantly, "You stealing silverware, bitch." And she had never, ever been more regal. Or if she has only been as regal. And I tell that story for a bit of levity, but also because in that moment, my mother taught me something which has never left me, which was that dignity was something that existed separate from class and circumstance. That one had the free will to be principled and thoughtful and self-respect and decent and even majestic, and no matter what the circumstances might be. And my mother was all of those things. Not only have I seen the face of death, which is to say that I've seen people at a young age abusing drugs and chasing Santa Claus in pursuit of a violent, sort of a justice for not receiving their gifts out of his volunteer sack. But my cousin, who was like my brother, with whom I grew up, was shot and killed when I was 25. My best friend was shot and killed execution style at 18. I watched my uncle quite truly try to sell me a half-drunk Snapple on a street corner in Harlem because he was out of his mind on crack. And this is not a talk that I want to descend into sort of the realm of Black pathology, but there is a very harsh reality that goes hand in hand with growing up in impoverished areas in the inner city and in America. And so I've seen that, and I've been forced to reckon with that. And it's been difficult. It's hurt my professional journey at times. Going to an elite school, which has made me a staunch integrationist, and not for the reasons that people might think, but going off to a prep school at 13 with some of the wealthiest children in the world, allowed me to see why integration was essential. And it wasn't because I was white aspiring, but it was because I finally was among the elite. And I realized that they were bums. I couldn't believe the slovenly idiots that I was among. And my self-esteem would never be low again because I knew how mediocre, in fact, the elite truly were, and that this was a performance. I should say that this didn't change when I went to Wesleyan University. It didn't change when I went to public university. It did change when I worked in civil rights. It was fascinating always to see beyond the mask of civility, the mask of sophistication to who a person really was. And so I graduated with all of these honors from high school, and I was still trying to make sense of my situation and my place in the world, why my family had ended up where they'd gone, what meritocracy really was. And I wasn't finding any answers. I didn't find them in college, and I went off and I attended this prestigious graduate program, and I did well, and I wrote well. And there came a time when I said, this is not for me. Things seemed bleak. Meritocracy seemed like a rigged game to me. The elite circles were populated by fools, I thought. and I'd had my third back surgery, and I sort of turned my back on the world. No pun intended. I needed to get away. And I left the writing world for a few years, partially to recover from nerve pain from a back surgery, but also because I was so disenchanted. And I think I'd lost my sense of humor, and one must keep his sense of humor. You have to keep your sense of humor if you're going to deal with the world. It is an absurd place, and if you're going to find the beauty in it, if you're going to dissect it, you have to also know how hilarious it is. And I'd lost that. Everything was too serious to me. It was too grave. And I was on the bus in Minneapolis with a friend coming from a movie. And for some reason, this friend, being a misguided white liberal, decided that it was a good idea to loan her phone to a man who had just gotten on the bus, who looked like he was off several pills and alcohol. And he took her phone, and I realized he had no intention of giving it back. And I decided, because my mother was a lunatic and engendered this into me and was ready to fight anyone who she thought ever was unjust, that I was going to get this phone back. You know, he was not small. No, luckily, I'm not small either. I'm 6'6", 250. And I think he assessed me and he realized this might not be an easy fight. Otherwise, I think he takes the phone. But after 7 stops, he pulled the lever to leave, to get off the bus. And I asked him, "What are you doing with the phone, buddy?" You know? And he said, "Why?" And I said, "You need to give her the phone back." And he says, "Does she need to make a call with it?" I said, "No, that's besides the point." And we had this face off here. And much to my surprise, he gave me the phone. Now, once he gave me the phone, something kicked in, as it does in many men. He felt he had been emasculated. And the next thing I knew, he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a gun that looked quite a bit like a novelty lighter, probably a .22, very small, and he put it on my hip. And he let me know if I wanted the phone, I would have taken the phone. And at that moment, I realized that there was nothing I could do. And I wondered, could I possibly bleed out from a shot from a very small gun on a really shitty bus in Minneapolis? Is this how it ends? Is this where the professional journey ends before it gets to Dr. Skinner giving me this wonderful introduction? Maybe. The one thing I knew from growing up with people like him was that you didn't give an inch in a situation like this. And so maybe because I'm insane, or maybe because I guessed right, I told him that he still wasn't getting anything. And we came to his stop, and the bus, you know, lurched down on its hydraulics. It picked back up when no one left. And he said, "Hold on, that's my stop." And he walked out backwards with the gun still on me, and he exited the bus, and he cursed at me a little from out the window. We drove on, we escaped, I lived. And I realized that these ghosts of my past, these friends who had died, these bright lights who had self-immolated, that I wasn't going to be able to pay any homage to them, that I wasn't going to do them any justice if I didn't get back to my career, if I didn't continue to write, if I didn't continue to play with the notions of narrative and history versus nostalgia, and critical and honest assessment of meritocracy, of race, of justice, of equity in America. And I picked myself up and I rejoined this very crazy writing world. And as you see, I speak a lot through anecdotes. I think a lot of writers do. I remember sitting on a bed in a hotel in Sweden. It's the first time I'd ever left the country. And my cousin asked me if I still believed in people, you know? And I said, "Do you mean that they exist?" And he paused for a moment, and I could hear him sorting through his thoughts on the other end of the phone, searching for what he actually meant. And he said, "No, do you still have faith in these motherfuckers?" And that was a complicated answer. He was in Brooklyn, or he had just left Brooklyn. He had grown up there his entire life, and he had gone to play baseball at a JUCO, a junior college in Tennessee. And he was in the Deep South, and his team was all white except for him. So it was a completely foreign terrain. He was homesick, culturally disoriented, and he was encountering things that he never imagined in terms of race and society. And I'd called him because I was in Sweden and I had never left the country, and I had been blown away by it. One of the first things you realize when you leave America is our country is extremely young and our culture is relatively immature. You know, everywhere I went in Scandinavia and most of Europe, it felt like there was a depth and authenticity that only comes with a long and rich rich history. And it was pleasant, and the streets were clean, and it was meager police presence and no homeless people on the streets, and the subway was clean. And as someone who took the 4-6 C&E growing up in New York City, you know that's a minor miracle. The subway not only was clean, but it came on time. And I called my cousin from Stockholm because he was one of my best friends, you know, and we'd grown up in similar circumstances with limited means and limited exposure to culture and diversity of experience. And the world can start to seem really small and terrible and claustrophobic when you grow up that way. And I wanted to tell him to keep going, that he was smarter than he thought. He was dynamic, he was unique. The world was a big place. He owed himself to expand his horizons and really engage the world. I wanted him to remind him of the time that he was with me when our Uncle Philip tried to sell us the half-drunk Snapple, unaware of who we were, you know, and thinking about how unglued a person can come from the world. You know, my Uncle Philip at one point was selling my grandmother's possessions on the street, bedding, dishes, photographs of her children and grandchildren. And I'm bemused even now reciting that, trying to imagine the thought process of a person who purchased the photo of my then 11-year-old cousin swinging a baseball bat, you know, for 50 cents on the street. Like who that, never mind who sells that, but who buys that? And I wanted to help to tell my cousin that, yeah, the world could be a horrible place, but there's much more to it than we grew up experiencing. And it's a beautiful place too. And you only find that by getting out of your comfort zone. And by the time he picked up the phone, I was so weirdly choked up and so awkward with my emotions that I just stammered, yo, the train comes on time. That was all I could tell him. And we got off the phone and I thought about my uncle more. You know, my uncle is not this flat character who used drugs and tried to sell his own nephew a Snapple. You know, he had lost his struggle with addiction. He lost a struggle with poverty and circumstance. He eventually died of AIDS. And I remember my Aunt Brenda sitting by his hospital bed for hours, bathing her little brother, when even the nurses didn't want to come near him. This was back in the day in the 80s and 90s when AIDS was still so wild and mysterious to people, that they didn't understand the risk and details of it. And the nurses quite truly didn't want to wash my uncle. And I play that moment back in my mind all the time. I always wonder if I have the capacity for that sort of kindness and that sort of love. And if I could go back to that conversation with my cousin, I'd remind him of his mother, making sure her baby brother maintained some semblance of dignity even at his lowest moments. And I would tell him that the capacity for that sort of dignity keeps us human. As foul and repellent as individuals seem, sometimes staying human in the face of it all is a legitimate triumph. That's a lesson I took from my time in civil rights. When I dropped out of school the first time, I got a job improbably working for the New York Civil Rights Coalition. My boss at the time was a vice president of the ACLU. He was on the board of directors of the NYCLU. He was a frequent contributor to the Daily News and the New York Post. He was often on Fox News and CNN. And what I learned from him was about procedure, dignity, struggle, and the fact that one had to be completely invested in principle to take any sort of victory from this society. And that principle was more important than sides always. I try to bring that to my scholarship too. In civil rights, it was difficult. I would have to say that I'm a little too sensitive for civil rights, which is to say you have to carry home your losses at the end of the day when you work in civil rights. And there are a lot of losses. You know, if you don't love civil rights, you should never work in civil rights. You know, it's almost like doing social work. The virtue is its own reward. And what I found out about government when I worked in civil rights was a little overwhelming. And I see some of those same bad actors from my New York days, both on the left and right, doing really strange things, even in 2020. And I'm happy I got out. Now, when I left civil rights and I went back to school, and I had all this public speaking experience under my belt and a greater understanding and appreciation for the human condition and what it took to triumph over circumstance and how complicated society and individual life could be, I began to work in admissions. In elite admissions, I just came back from New York City where I shot footage for a documentary about equity in admissions. I mean, admissions, if you're at Carnegie Mellon and you don't understand at this point, what a crapshoot elite education can be and what a rigged game it is. And I feel sorry for you. But elite admissions was its own sort of sausage factory, which is to say that there's an old adage about sausage factories, which is it's fine to eat the sausage until you worked in the factory and you see how it's made. And that was the experience I had in college admissions. It was fascinating. I traveled a lot. I had a great title. My office was huge. My salary was meager. I don't know if any of you have ever watched Cheers. There's a fantastic episode of Cheers that sums up so much of capitalism, and it sums up so much of corporations, and it certainly sums up my time in admissions. A person, one of the bartenders at Cheers realizes, I haven't had a raise in 4 years, goes into the back office to the manager and says, I want a raise. Manager says, oh, that's great. What do you mean that's great? I thought you were going to ask for a title. Says, wait a minute. Okay, wait, I want a title then. Okay, you're the executive bartender. Goes out and he tells people, they say, do you have a raise? No, I didn't get a raise, but you're looking at the executive bartender. Coworkers flip out. Waitress goes in. What is going on? Okay, you are the head chief waitress. Boom, goes out, head chief waitress. Last person standing, can't believe it. Heads in. You are the senior executive bartender. By the end of the episode, they're all competing over titles. No one's gotten a damn dime, And that's how admissions felt. I traveled, I had a business card, I wore a suit, I spoke to audiences. People treated me with respect because I was a gatekeeper and I could barely make my rent. And ethically, we weren't doing the sorts of things that I thought we would. At Wesleyan, which at that time was the most liberal campus in America, the most progressive campus in America, according to Mother Jones. And of course, I'd been out in the world and I worked in civil rights, and I knew that this was nonsense. The faculty told us one thing in the classroom, and the administration did another thing in their decision-making, And so there was not much emphasis on process in admissions. There was not much philosophical debate. There was no intellectual climate there. And at the end of 3 years, I fled to get an MFA. And there's a theme of my life. One is that life picks me up and it drops me off in strange places that I, if you know my origins, I should not be. But the other is that I run like hell to get away from these places once I've been there too long, because I've gathered the information I need and it's time to move on for my own sanity. And so I left and I got into writing. Now, writing led me to Carnegie Mellon. And I guess really there's no neat line you can draw from my career. It's been a series of me and probably ended up places, triumphing over really terrible circumstance, learning among the elite at universities, prep schools, graduate schools, and then fleeing because I think so many of us in these elite groups have bought into the world as an ahistorical vacuum. We've bought into our own mythologies. And so writing was the one place that allowed me to unpack some of this, to make sense of the line between mythology and reality. The absurdity, of course, of the stories we tell ourselves versus the realities we live. This great chasm between who we are and who we pretend we are in public. There was an anecdote that I wanted to tell you about ending up in Iowa and going to an antique shop. I have no idea how long I've been rambling, so I'm just going to check in and see if I'm still okay on time, because I tend to just go off on tangents. So let me just make sure. Am I okay for time?
You are. We have about 20 minutes.
Okay, terrific. So yeah, I was talking about civil rights a bit, and one thing I take away from civil rights and the person I worked for, who was extremely intelligent, principled, really remarkable. One of the few people I've ever met who couldn't be categorized. People attacked him for being extremely liberal. People attacked him for being extremely conservative. Normally it was a reflection of the audience rather than what he was doing. He sort of stuck to his principles at all times. He taught me that fighting for principle meant moving beyond the narrow constriction of self-interest, which is something I think is lost even at the academic level. And that fighting for a side establishes a dichotomy between values and actions. And that fighting for a side is the path of least resistance. Whereas fighting for a principle is a risk that can cost you the support of institutions and communities and friends. But fighting for a principle is the only thing that can unite us in social betterment. And I took that away from civil rights. And that was on my mind when I was in Iowa City. Strange place for a person from Harlem to end up, but I loved it dearly, and I still do. Try to visit. Before COVID, I visit 2-3 times a year. But I would take trips to the surrounding towns. And one day I took a trip out to a town called Mount Vernon. There's a school there called Cornell College, I believe, not to be confused with, the Ivy League, a small liberal arts school. And I remember we were walking around. It was this sort of, it was like out of American dream propaganda as well. It's like there's a nice little store. There's one main street, couple bars, brick oven pizza, and then an old antique store. And we went into this store, which I think was called Polly Ann's. And I found a bunch of artifacts of sort of a more overtly racist past, like a glass with the Sambo caricature playing the banjo, a series of framed cream of wheat ads featuring sort of happy darkies who were speaking phrases and thought bubbles in broken English, and Mammy themed salt and pepper shakers, cartoons that had these big lipped caricatures, chucking spears. But I also found this August 27th, 1965 issue of Life magazine. It was a bargain. It was $7, which was like $20 cheaper than any of the racist memorabilia. So it kind of drove home this heavy-handed point that racism has always been much more profitable in America than any genuine commitment of Black American life to the historical record. In this Life issue, August 27, 1965, which I still have, I plan to get it framed, was about the LA riots. And these riots in America have always struck me as a sort of amplification of this slow inward riot in the hearts of a lot of the dispossessed citizens here who face societal contempt. And so, as I said, I wanted to frame it and hang it, and I still have it in my back office as a tribute to and a reminder of the complicated history of the Black struggle against inequality and racism and oppression. And instead, I just kind of ended up reading the issue from cover to cover on a Wednesday night, and over 50 years later, what was really striking was that there was little difference between the frustration and injustice then and now. Black people are still raging aimlessly as the victims of white supremacy in some cities pile up. And lives are ruined at the hands of those who enforce law. And then just as now, a lot of people in the public sphere have inverted the rhetoric and revised the narratives of these deaths in order to maintain a sense of self-respect and innocence in the face of moral turpitude. And the aggressor becomes the objective observer, and the victims are the immoral antagonists. 2 weeks before the 65 Watts riots, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, upon signing the Voting Rights Act, said that today the Negro story and the American story fuse and blend. This was 65. The Life editorial astutely acknowledged that the promise of American democracy has always aroused expectations that take more than laws to fulfill. In human matters, changes of policy must be accompanied by changes in attitudes and within individual hearts. Equality for minority groups necessitate understanding and a depth of empathy rather than empty posturing. But empathy has never been a strong point in this country. In 1965, as the Watts riots calmed, the Los Angeles police chief then was William Parker, and he compared Blacks to monkeys in the zoo. He doubled down on the condescension and contempt, and that spurred the riots, and he said, "We're on the top and they're on the bottom." In 2016, one of our reps echoed that sort of condescension and contempt and said that Black people rioting in Charlotte hate white people because white people are successful and they're not. The rhetoric hasn't changed much. The lack of empathy hasn't changed much in this country. And the other shocking thing was toward the back of that issue of life, there was an article on the US gun problem. This is again, 1965, that lamented the availability and indiscriminate sale of firearms. The more things changed, it seems that the more they say the same. You can arm yourself in the 5 and dime, one of the headlines screams in a big bold font. And there's an accompanying picture of an ad for a gun that was deemed the N-word getter, which comes with the N-word back guarantee. The clerk at the Florida gun store elaborated on the NR Davis 12 gauge shotgun. Shoot an N-word with it, bring it back, and we'll give you your money back. And we'll let you keep the gun too. It was like reading a sort of prophecy. And so in this class where we read Marilyn Robinson, just as in my work in civil rights, and in the work I did in college admissions, I'm constantly trying to remind people that we have to reckon honestly and morally with America's history, that you can't privilege nostalgia over history, or that you live in a cycle. And that cycle has been beneficial to me as a teacher, because I can still trot Baldwin and Joan Didion and whomever else out in 2020 and have it be as pertinent as ever. But it's very depressing as an observer of history. My professional journey should be sort of a stellar example of a success story. But there's a part of me that, I'm not going to say I've come to the end of it, because I haven't. I'm in the middle of it. But I reflect on it and I feel that I'm a failure who's been successful to some degree. And to another degree, I'm a success that has failed. I don't say that to be macabre. I say that to keep myself grounded and to know that this is sort of continuum, perpetual, that I haven't achieved unless the collective has achieved more. My individual success says very little. When I went back to New York this past weekend to contribute to this documentary, I took a ferry. This ferry didn't exist when I was growing up in New York, and it's clearly not an officially sanctioned ferry, but product of real estate developers who want to make the city more accessible to new corporate employees. So you can quickly get to Queens, you can quickly get to Long Island City, Manhattan, wherever. My entire life I've been hoping for motor transportation like that. It took me an hour and a half to get anywhere too far from where I lived. This takes 5-10 minutes. But I was on this ferry and we went to a neighborhood that's been renamed. And I was catching up with a friend who I was the best man in his wedding. I introduced him to his wife. And so whenever I'm in the city, I try to stop by and see him. And we got a coffee at a coffee shop called Parlor. I'll never forget it because there were quite truly people roasting the beans in the window of the coffee shop. And I ordered a latte, and it took 20 minutes and no one was ahead of me. One began to imagine that they'd actually gone to a mountain to pick the bean, to make the coffee, or that they were so prescient that they were delivering the coffee into the future, anticipating where I might be when I got the cup. It was like, what is this incredibly pretentious coffee shop? And I wondered what kind of city I was in. And we walked 2 blocks up, and suddenly it was like I was Proust. I was overwhelmed by this sense of memory. I was under a bridge that I'd known since I was 5 years old. And I was in this horrible neighborhood, as I knew it, in Fort Greene, where my aunts have had a condo upstairs and downstairs for 40 years. And I realized I was on their block. I hadn't seen them in 20 years. And as we walked, one of my aunts was outside on her stoop. And it brought me in direct conflict with myself. I wondered what my individual success meant in terms of the collective. Here were my aunts, 40 years after buying this condo in this terrible neighborhood, disoriented in a neighborhood that was changing before their eyes, that had a new name in certain areas, seeing their nephew who was getting off this ferry, who didn't even intend to see them. And I was forced to wonder what it was worth, what we paid into and what we'd gotten as a return. And I wasn't sure anymore. And I guess that's what propels me forward as a professional. What was the price of the ticket? What has our suffering and experience been worth? How do we parse those details? How do we do so without falling into the trap of perpetual grievance? How do we make sense of American society and our place in it as individuals? And so I guess that's the connective thread from admissions to civil rights, to creative writing, to my academic pursuits, is that I feel that I carry a burden of these ghosts, of the dispossessed, of giving them voice. And that's hard work, and it's worthy work. So anyway, I'm done with this hopping around from tangent to tangent and trying to weave it together into some sort of tapestry that makes sense. And I'm happy to take any questions.
We are getting close to time, but I think some people will want to stay a little bit longer to ask questions if Professor England will do so. So feel free to stay on. First of all, thank you so much for that literary and cultural look at your background and putting some levity into issues of race in America, of which I think if you face it every single day, if you don't have some kind of sense of humor, you can't really deal with the reality of who we are in this nation. So I just thank you for that. I was between tears and laughter at various points in your presentation, and I think that's the reality of our nation. I would just like to talk about CMU a little bit, because you, along with Professor Purcell, wrote an important essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's probably the first in the history of CMU where two Black male professors try to take on the institution on the issues of race, the reality of race versus the rhetoric of race. And can you talk a little bit about why you did that? You're pretty young in your career. White guys do it all the time, and then they're called hotshots. Often when Black faculty or Blacks in America do those kinds of things, they're seen as out of their place. And so tell me a little bit about what motivated that, what you're seeing at CMU. Has there been some improvement in our environment? Are these DEI initiatives and President Farnham Johannian's big race initiative that has all kinds of layers to it, is this changing the environment? Are you pleased with what we're doing?
Sure. I don't know if I'm allowed to do this. Would I be allowed to invite Rich in to comment if he wanted as well? Could he unmute himself? He doesn't have to, and I just would, I don't want to speak for Rich, and certainly he co-wrote the piece with me. But
sure, if he wants to join us.
If you want to, Rich, you don't have to. But academia is such a strange place, and I'm preaching to the choir here. And mostly, I try to stay out of its way and hope that it stays out of mine. I want to teach my classes. I enjoy my students. I mostly enjoy my colleagues. And so I try to keep my head down and carve out my own space. What gets my attention is when I feel that my own dignity and my own humanity are being insulted. Those are non-negotiable for me. And so I think for me, that's what spurred the writing of this piece. And we wrote just to say that we respect the institution. And if we're going to continue to respect the institution and feel somewhat simpatico with the institution, that the institution has to respect us as well, has to respect us as scholars and not as window dressing, that we should be engaged, that when people write about these issues, that they probably should seek the input of the relatively sparse number of Black faculty members they have at Carnegie Mellon. Now, in terms of my observations about CMU, they're incomplete. I've been here 3 years. And that makes me extremely young in terms of this culture. Pittsburgh is its own historical, strange mess. Beautiful city aesthetically, fascinating city historically. In terms of the culture here, it seems to be an extremely segregated city that's still dealing with itself and sorting itself out. Carnegie Mellon doesn't seem to be that different from Pittsburgh in terms of not quite having sorted itself out in terms of race. And there's a lot of progressive rhetoric. And I wrote about this in the piece about Jessica Krug. It's fascinating to be on campuses, and here I won't single out Carnegie Mellon, this is many campuses where you have the illusion of progressivism and liberalism through rhetoric and the eagerness to employ acronyms and buzzwords, but you don't have any real substantive progressivism and liberalism when it comes to race and engage in different voices and a wide span of voices. So that was concerning. And I think that's spurred us on. Now, why we did it, obviously, I'm an idiot. I didn't hold my security, my job security, over my personal principles, and that's something that's plagued me throughout my career. So I guess I did it because my mother is crazy, and she infected me as well. It seemed like the right thing to do, and it seemed like a necessary conversation. If we want to be in step with the lofty principles we claim, then we have to have difficult conversations, and we have to invite people into those conversations we traditionally shun. We can't just affirm our own egos, right? We can't just affirm our preconceived notions. And so I wrote that in good faith, hoping that Carnegie Mellon agreed with me at the end of the day.
Well, thank you for writing it. I don't think you're crazy. I wish I had written it myself, but I wasn't even part of that circumstance, which is a whole different matter. I'm going to turn to Allie for the question and the answer function. I think you want to take it over there. But while she gets ready for that, to respond to the questions that are coming forth, I would like you to respond, if you don't mind, if you can do this pretty quickly. 50 Cent, who is a well-known rapper and cultural icon in the hip hop world, has endorsed Donald Trump for president. And he said, looking at the Biden economic plan, that if he didn't endorse Trump, he would become 20 Cent instead of 50 Cent. He also said, and I'm trying to quote, and I believe that this happened today, that he says, "I don't care. Trump doesn't like Black people." And then, he's saying that there's an economic reason to vote for Trump. Along with 50 Cent, friends of mine in the Republican Party and the conservative world have been working on having other Black rappers and hip hop leaders join, including Ice Cube. And so what do you think about all of this?
Oh, I think that we've come to a fascinating point in American society generally on the left and the right. We're mesmerized by buffoons. I wouldn't call 50 Cent a buffoon to his face, but even at 6'6", 250, 50 Cent is a singularly fascinating case study in terms of someone who came out of South Jamaica, Queens, hustling drugs, possibly having killed people or having had them killed, shot 9 times, triumphing, becoming a mega millionaire and a producer. 50 Cent is a hardcore, self-centered, narcissistic capitalist, and I would expect nothing less from 50 Cent. As far as the Ice Cube, who was just selling lordships in Scotland, I don't know if people know about that. I don't even know what that means, but Ice Cube was hawking lordships in Scotland while and selling them in character. He was saying, "Your homeboy Ice Cube got lordships in Scotland, yay, yay." And I was watching this in horror. It seemed like a minstrel show. I think that there are 2 things happening here, though. One is that there's a real appeal to this sort of Uberman, ultra-masculine presentation of the South that Trump does. That does appeal to plenty of Black men who are not so different from white men, and that they're Americans. The other is that there's not a lot of maneuvering room on the left. I think the left and the right are, and I was just discussing this with a couple of colleagues, I feel that I'm surrounded by fundamentalists on all sides, that there are these really strict litmus tests that are driving a lot of people toward a really nebulous middle space. when they're not particularly thrilled with candidates on either side. So I don't know that I would read too much into anything 50 Cent does. So I don't know how to answer that. And I don't know what to think about Ice Cube, but I do know that there are a lot of charlatans and a lot of buffoons on both sides now who are profiting royally from the general spectacle that people are addicted to. As long as we watch it, as long as we celebrate it, I can't say that they're wrong to do it.
I thank you for trying to make some sense of the madness, but I'll turn it over to Allie. I don't think I can make sense of any of it.
Thanks, Dr. Skinner. Our first question is going to come from Martina Rethman. Martina.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in today. I'm also a student who's in the creative writing department, but also in IPS, who's obviously putting this event on. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what you see that connection being between, the world of literature and high-minded, like academic, I'm gonna go read the Canterbury Tales for the billionth time, and kind of how you can reconcile that type of world with the really fast-paced political world that's going on right now.
Well, I don't think that the world of literature and the world of the Canterbury Tales necessarily overlap. Like I can recite the prologue of the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, believe it or not. It was something I was taught in high school. And they swore it would work at cocktail parties and win me friends. I promise you, it never did. Nobody wants to hear that shit. It's like Wanda Rapper the shower Solta and all that stuff. No one cares about it, right? But that was more sort of like the technical English nerds who taught like Middle English and theory. Creative writing and modern creative writing are so separate from that. And I don't think creative writing is as high-minded as Canterbury Tales. That's one thing I'll say. But how does it fit into like politics? I think it distills the political. It distills social movements. I took this brilliant course in college with a professor named Sally Bachner, who wrote a book that my colleague Rich Purcell reviewed and didn't like. Won't hold it against him. Book might not have been that good. But Sally Bachner herself as a teacher was quite good. And the book was History and Violence in the American Novel. And one of the sticking points, it was a book that was cross-listed. One of the great things, there were many goofy things about Wesley. One of the great things was how interdisciplinary it was. So that an English course could be a history course, a philosophy course. And this course asked the question as to whether or not history was best told through fiction or nonfiction. Is there such a thing as objective text? Could something like Don DeLille's Libra give us a more complete understanding of the JFK assassination, and that it captures the sort of aura, the mood, the environment of the time, the psychology of the sort of person who would shoot JFK, men in small rooms in the 70s. And so I think that creative writing at its best is extremely noble. It's an attempt to give this shape and this distillation for common people to read and access these outrageous political movements. How do you make sense of not only 50 Cent endorsing Donald Trump, but of that even being a story that we're supposed to pay attention to? I think cold, objective history might miss that. I think a novel could catch the sort of environment that produces that. So fiction and politics and history, to me, at its best, fiction moves in step with those, and it translates those to people who just don't have the time to do that sort of thinking, right? So those things seem deeply connected to me. The creative never seems that far removed from the practical and the pertinent to society. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but I don't find those to be divorced. They are always on my mind when I'm writing.
Professor Herbst, I saw you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I would like to ask a question. So thank you for this. This is wonderful. This is a voice that we really need to hear. One thing I'm curious about is the relationship between fiction, imagining futures and so on, and technology. I mean, obviously that's one of the things that happens a lot here, is trying to invent the new technologies of the future. And I just wonder if you could say anything about the role of fiction, imagining dystopian futures, imagining better futures, and the role that that might play in helping and kind of guide and direct the way that we develop technologies.
I almost don't even know what you said, because as a person who grew up in New York City, your office is fantastic. What that is huge.
I have to
What a
tell you,
great space.
Jim is a department head in in the School of Computer Science. So
That is a fantastic space. I'm obsessed with space. I have a mentor who is obsessed with how people enter rooms. There are like little strange obsessions that we have that tell us so much about the world and ourselves. And one is, whenever I see space, I'm drawn to it. It's tough. You know, I'm not someone who writes dystopian fiction, and I don't write historical fiction. And I feel a couple different ways about that. One is that I've always distrusted bad dystopian fiction. Which is to say that people who are imagining apocalyptic times where the world is crumbling, to me, it's proof positive that they grew up in some sort of bubble, because you don't have to go 50 years into the future. The future is now, it's right there. You know, it seems like an abnegation, a denial of exactly what's happening. But in terms of imagining a better future, I think that's what our best fiction has always done. Now, the problem is that we marginalize fiction writers. I don't think that we take them very seriously in academia. And I understand that to some extent. I was on the path to do a PhD when I was in college. I did a Mellon Fellowship. I did 2 theses in college. One was creative. The other was analytical. And it was, what was it called? It was called The Reinscription of Patriarchal Bias on 1970s Black Feminist Literature. Just reciting that makes me remember why I fled doing a PhD. You know, I was writing in a language that people who I wanted to read the material were fundamentally locked out of, right? But what I found was, one, doing a PhD is so much more rigorous than doing an MFA in so many ways, in terms of the process of actually attaining the degree. But the other thing was that the creative thesis for me was much more difficult to produce. And so there are these sort of dueling things. One is that, for good reason, academia looks at MFAs and they're like, that's not a PhD. But on the other hand, I think academia oftentimes does not take fiction as seriously as they should. They don't grant a certain level of respect to fiction writers. They just see them as those kooks who are off in the whatever wing it is of the second floor of Dietrich. When some of the stuff we're working to is extremely pertinent to the imagination and the fundamental reconstruction of society. So the question as to like how that informs that, I guess that depends on the department. It depends on collaboration. It depends on how seriously people take us and how often they invite us in to talk with them. I think that would be fantastic. One of the things that I lament is that Carnegie Mellon is at the forefront of all of these fields. And very few people reach out to me to bring me in and welcome me in and let me see exactly what's happening and whether or not they could influence my work and vice versa. So I wish there were more collaborative efforts on this campus, and maybe there are, and I don't know it. And so I don't want to judge and say that, you know, so I don't want to reprimand this campus for something they're actually doing. It could be that I missed out on it, but it seems that there's a paucity of that.
So if I could jump in, I would like to right now invite you in. I would love to have you come and talk to ISR, meet our students. I wish we could do that in person, but maybe we could arrange a session on Zoom, something like this, but with ISR. I think we would love to hear your voice and get your ideas and be influenced by you, and maybe have a chance to influence your thinking as well.
That would be fascinating. You know, I would love that look into what you do, and I welcome it. So if you contact me anytime, I promise you I'll get right back to you.
All right, I will do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Our next question is going to come from Alex O.
Hello, Professor England. I'm currently a graduate student studying international relations and politics. I first want to thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us. I've really enjoyed the conversation so far, and I found it quite inspiring. I think for the first one of these professional journey talks, you've set the bar pretty high. So my question kind of draws upon an article you wrote for Vox in May of last year addressing the school admissions process. And in this article, you kind of talk about how school admissions unfairly prioritize early decisions, are contingent on wealth, and don't necessarily take into account applicants' actual capabilities and potential. And at the very end, you mentioned that it's likely that it won't change from within, probably won't amend the system. So I'm wondering, my question to you is, what will it take to kind of reform the admission process, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's, I should have an answer right off the cuff. And I just sat with a documentary film crew discussing this very issue. So forgive me for not having an answer off the cuff, but it's a complicated question. What you're asking is whether or not institutions are willing to reform themselves, and they are in rhetoric. Whether they are in reality is a different story. When we talked about this, someone asked me this Monday when we were filming, said, what if you just threw a bunch of names into a hat? Would that be less random and more preferable in admissions process and this and that? And I said, it doesn't require all that. You know what it requires for an institution to change it? It requires a decision. Now, you might not have noticed this, but an institution does whatever the hell it wants when it wants to do it. Now, it's when you ask it to do something it doesn't want to do that it says, how will we do that? I don't know how will we find the money? Can we get people to agree? No one's asking if people agree if they want to do something. If they want to put a new building up, if they want to tell you, students go here, bathrooms are either gender neutral or not, they just do it. And so what it takes to reform is a genuine commitment from the institution. Now, barring that, it takes serious pressure from people who might give that institution money. Now, that could be applicants, that could be their parents. That takes a buy-in at a societal level. Will we see that? That remains to be seen, but really the student body has to hold the university accountable to its own professed ideals, right? If we want to have these really nice, lofty sounding mission statements, then sometimes you have to hold the administration's feet to the fire to live up to it, right? It's that simple. Now, I don't envy the students at CMU their schedules. It seems like this is, whether it's that the students protest too much and it's become part of their identity, or whether it's a reality, I won't know because I'm not a student here, but it seems like the students are pretty damn overwhelmed at Carnegie Mellon. They study a lot, they work a lot. This isn't a particularly, it's not a hotbed for activism. It doesn't seem like students even have time, and not to mention that so much of the student body is international here. And that's not to cast aspersions on an international community, it's just to say, if you don't have an investment in domestic issues, then it's hard to believe that you'll fight for them. It's almost too much to ask, it's an unrealistic expectation. And so it would take pressure from the student body. It would take pressure from potential customers, because let's face it, higher education is a business. But if you want to, as a student, go to a school that reflects society, then elite education has to bend to fit that desire you have, right? At this point, it does not offer that. No, and I don't think what I'm saying is particularly radical. And one of the things I told the film crew was that I came out of admissions knowing that there were many disparities in terms of race. Of course, I knew that going in, but I felt extreme sympathy with groups I never imagined. I felt sympathy for Asians, especially Asians who were impoverished. You couldn't believe some of the people coming out of New York who were rejected despite their qualifications because they looked like flat applicants, whatever that might mean in the dean's eye. I came out there sympathetic toward white women who were going to their fourth choices rather than their first when they were overqualified. I came out there extremely sympathetic to working class white people who had no shot in the game, none, and didn't realize it. And then felt extremely angry toward minority groups who hadn't robbed them of a spot, in fact, but the system had. And so I guess what I'm saying in the end is it takes the processing and intelligent presentation of the facts about admissions to the public for them to even know that they should apply pressure. And we're living in a time where, spectacle trumps discourse. Right? It does. I think, 50 Cent and Ice Cube, of course, are not intellectuals. 50 Cent and Ice Cube don't speak for any constituencies, but 50 Cent and Ice Cube, they bring clicks. Meg Thee Stallion brings clicks when she writes an op-ed in the New York Times. no one cares what Meg Thee Stallion has to say, and they shouldn't. Meg Thee Stallion doesn't have a PhD. Meg Thee Stallion is not an activist and not an intellectual. But whether on the left or the right, we've bought into the idea that you need spectacle in order to galvanize the attention of the masses, right? And so that piece I wrote in Vox stood out for me, and that it was so difficult to even get it published anywhere. And that I wrote it because so many people were talking about college admissions and had no idea what they were talking about. And so until people actually understand what's happening in college admissions, you can't mount any movement toward equity in college admissions and fairness and understanding of why it's important. I don't know if I'm rambling again or if I answered your question at all, but I apologize if I did not.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Our next question will come from Professor Fields Black.
Hi there.
Hello.
Thank you so much. This is a really fascinating talk. And I guess I'm wondering about the next step in your journey.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, tenure is contingent on that next step, being the production of 2 different books, which I'm working on. One is creative and one is nonfiction. And I've been patient. It's difficult again, and I'll go back to what I said about college admissions and spectacle. Things have changed quite a bit in terms of writing. I think good writing demands patience. It demands distance. It demands examination. And these are things that culture don't reward right now, especially with the advent of social media. You have to have instantaneous reactions to everything. But instantaneous reactions are just by nature shallow reactions. And so I'm an old soul. I always have been. I quite truly am one of the only people in my peer group that listen to Nancy Wilson records. I listen to Gladys Knight. I listen to old music. I write in old styles. I read literature that's from 40 years ago, and I believe in old processes. And so I think that writing matters. I don't think it matters simply as credentialism. I've had offers every time I write one of these pieces for the Chronicle or Vox or whatever it is. There's always someone who emails and says, "Hey, I'm from the University of Ohio Press or Georgia Press, and we would publish a book of your essays right now if you get in touch with us," or Vanderbilt Press or whatever it was, or a book about college admissions, and it would sell because people love it. But who the hell wants to write about college admissions for 200 pages? I want to write about it when it's principled, when it's applicable to society, and when it might influence the discourse in some way. But writing about it because it's sensationalized and because it might make me a quick $100,000 is antithetical to why I do what I do. And so I guess the next step of my journey is not only the completion of this, but hopefully carving out a space at Carnegie Mellon where I'm contributing to the community, where I actually am attracting students to the creative writing major and where I'm working with people across departments. After 3 years here, I feel a little more comfortable. I'm getting to know people and I'm understanding the institution better. But what I really feel is a sense of isolation. And I don't want to feel that way. I believe in community. And if it's not there, I believe in forcing it. And if you can't force that damn community and carve it out, then I believe in leaving. Now, I don't want to leave Carnegie Mellon, but I do think it's really important for me to build bridges outside of the creative writing program. And so I'm hoping to, and this is a main reason that I was really excited that Dr. Skinner invited me to give this talk, because I never meet anybody. I think we had coffee the one time, and that was wonderful, but it was also a reminder that I don't know anyone at Carnegie Mellon outside of my department, and mostly not outside of my program. And that seems lamentable because this is a small enough community. When people talk about Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon and the culture, a part of that is there seems to be a coldness. It seems that there's something, everyone is off on their own, doing their own thing. And you can see why the students are the way they are. This doesn't feel quite like a home the way it easily could. And I'm informed by my personal experience, which is to say that my homelessness at a young age has chased me out into the world in search of a home. And this is what I find most American about myself. I have to create myself. I have to find my home. And my goal is to find a home at Carnegie Mellon. You know, it's not to be here and flee or be here and come back to my you know, living space and collect a paycheck. And so I'm hoping the next chapter here in my professional journey is to actually find a home. That's been my dream all along. So,
Thank you.
it's very good to see you.
So I know we're way over on time. Thank you everyone for staying. We have one more question, so I want to make sure we get to Ruel. Please, Ruel.
Thanks, Professor England, for coming on. It was an excellent discussion. I'm just sort of curious how you would, like you said, you wanted to do outreach and creative writing to like our community. I'm interested how you would do that. Like, say, like a Pittsburgh public school student who like from necessarily the privileged background that many creative writing students may come from, or stuff like that. Like, how would you convince someone to when the creative writing instead of a more quote unquote lucrative field? Or
Did you say you're from Pittsburgh?
Nah, I'm not.
Oh, you're asking me how I would appeal to a student in Pittsburgh.
Like someone that's like doesn't necessarily have like come from a privileged background in Pittsburgh. That was just the example. Like
Sure. Well, shit. I mean, good Lord, that's a great question. It's a question I've heard asked before. I don't know if you know who Edward Jones is. Edward P. Jones wrote a couple great collections of short fiction and a novel that won him a Pulitzer, I believe. If it wasn't Pulitzer, it was the National Book Award, but he's a treasure. He writes great fiction. Real strange man. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. He's a peculiar person. And I recall him being asked this very question when I was a grad student. And it was a Black woman, her name was Keisha Lynn. Keisha Lynn said, Mr. Jones, when did you give yourself permission to be a creative writer? And I knew what she meant. She meant if you don't come from a privileged background, how do you get into a career this damn frivolous? You know, and that's a question that haunts me. It is, you know, it's sort of, this is the paradox of going to an elite school, right? You may have your principles, you may believe in learning for learning's sake, but if you get there and you have, like I have, a family that is in desperate need of financial uplift, how do you go into creative writing? How do you not take a corporate gig? You know, how do you continue to do college admissions when an admissions firm wants you to work for them advising wealthy families for $150,000 a year? Those are difficult decisions to make. But I think there's something transformative in the work you do as a creative writer. And so Edward Jones's answer to Keisha was, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. I didn't need anybody's permission. And I felt his answer, but I also thought that he sidestepped her question. So I'm going to try not to sidestep yours. One is, you do what you were meant to do, and you can't run away from it. You know, the thing is that you have to have models that let people know who are not traditionally in these spaces that they can thrive and exist in these spaces. Being a writer is absolute madness, and it's awful. My mentor said, Jason, you're a writer and it's what you're gonna do. And I got hired in admissions, and the dean of admissions told me a secret. She said, you know what? I talked to Gail Pemberton was her name, the person who mentored me. She was brilliant professor at Wesleyan. So I talked to Gail, and I talked to her about the fact that she said, you're a writer and that's what you're gonna do. I asked her, how do you have a life? How does Jason have a life as a writer when he leaves admissions? And she said, he doesn't. That's the trick. You got to figure it out. There is no life as a writer, but I couldn't tell him that. Now, the truth is, it's a labor of love. And it is. It's a completely finicky and strange and whimsical field. You know, you can't guarantee your success in this field. It's really about purpose. And I think higher education, to some extent, is sometimes about letting people know that regardless of how much money you make, that there's a different measure of success, spiritual success, success in terms of the contributions you make to society, shaping policy, shaping narrative. You know, it was Du Bois who said that all art is propaganda. You know, and that's not a bad thing. That art is a way that you can finally grab narrative and reclaim it. You can tell your own story. I think that is more worthwhile than any corporate gig I could have ever gotten. And I hope that when I stand in front of rooms, that's clear to people who are like me. Now, what the problem is that I don't often stand in front of those rooms. And this is something that I thought about quite a bit at Carnegie Mellon when we were talking about the MLK Awards, for instance. I like that the MLK Awards celebrate MLK and his spirit. What I would also like is if we applied that locally to sending people into the Pittsburgh public school system who look like the people who attend those underfunded schools, you know, who give them an example so that they do not acquiesce to low expectations, so that they understand that there are models out there for them. And do I want to participate in that? Yes, I do. Do I want to participate in that more after I get tenure, hopefully? Yes, because right now my time's stretched thin. But I'm willing to do so right now. And I think there are plenty of people willing to do so. But that also depends on this campus and the administration and the powers that be facilitating stronger connections between the community and the campus. If people are willing to do that, I'm here for it.
Thank you, everyone, for all of your questions. I'm going to give the mic back to Dr. Skinner now for wrap up.
Thank you so much to Professor England for taking all of this time to speak with us so honestly. And for many on the call, you know, I've had some private chats. Their colleagues in technical fields or disciplines that are far from what you study. This is, I think, been important on those levels as well, not just about race, not just about your background, but about bringing us together, as you've said, at CMU and getting to know each other. This, in my view, was a very successful first Journeys lecture. We'll do a little huddle afterwards with the Student Activities Committee, which is actually well represented here, to see their thoughts. But we learned a lot. We got more out of this conversation than I could have expected. And we're really glad that the English department hired you. On occasion, CMU does something right. So I think we feel good about your hire, your honesty, and I see in you some of the things I did and said 20 years ago. You know, I used to get myself in lots of trouble at CMU intentionally. Now it just happens. So, you know, you think you have a bright future. We look forward to working with you. Thanks to the audience, to the students, faculty, and staff assembled. And we will be doing this again very soon. I believe one of our next ones is with Professor Conrad Tucker, an African professor, who I assume is now African American in the engineering school. And like Professor England, is relatively new to CMU. So with that, thank you. Please have a great evening. Please watch the debate and be in touch with 50 Cent. Thank you. Good night.